Where did we leave off last time? I think
Oh
we,
man, let's see.
we were
What
discussing
were
these
we talking about?
principles in the context, if I recall correctly, of concern about the adaptation of institutions to, well, I suppose it's a fairly generic problem of disruption, but specifically to do with the arrival of very intelligent machines in the near future.
Yeah, that's right. We were. Well, you quite correctly pointed out. Sorry, I'm munching on stuff here. And you quite correctly pointed out that I mean these general principles, they're, I mean they're pretty shallow platitudes in a way, and there are circumstances in which those are nevertheless valuable. I mean they can sort of keep you on the right track, keep you from straying too far um, from sensible terrain. But there's not a whole lot of specific content here, and so we I think we need to try to break down analytically. We need to analyze the specific challenges that AI poses, the specific ways in which AI is likely to alter circumstances upon which incumbent well, just our whole incumbent system, our whole mode of producing and consuming and organizing and governing and all the rest of that, in relation to resources and material and energy in the natural world, that kind of thing. I mean, all of that is going to change because so much of that system as a whole and all of the structures and components of it, they're all premised on this idea that humans are the source of are the only source of uh, intelligent work, intelligent labors. The only thing that can perform complex tasks, and complex tasks are essential for the functioning of virtually every aspect of the production system that. And I use that in the broadest general sense, even more broadly than the economy, as it were. We used to sort of have a global way of meeting human needs, of producing things, goods and services, and but more than that, reproducing and reproducing organizations and institutions and all kinds of tangible and intangible infrastructure and culture and traditions. But all of this stuff gets produced and reproduced in a system, and all of that is premised on this basic assumption that only human beings can do the complex tasks that are required, um, or only human beings can do necessary, needful, complex tasks. And to the extent that we've succeeded in allowing machines to take over some tasks, they've only been the dumbest of tasks. The very, for example, my book that I'm very close to finishing here, I distinguish between automation and mechanization, which I think are useful terms. They're not quite widespread terms of art. Some people use those same terms, but I'm quite careful to distinguish between using technology and in particular machines to mechanize versus using them to automate. And under that rubric, mechanization is something that you can do with a very simple task. Like a bulldozer it allows you to mechanize the relatively simple and mindless task of moving earth around in certain ways, certain very simple ways. And there's a great deal of power in mechanization. I mean, a bulldozer can move more earth in an hour than a team of 100 guys with shovels can move in a month. I mean, it's incredibly potent. These machines and these instruments of sort of modernity, as it were, are enormously powerful. But they're dumb, and they still require a human operator and monitoring or a human constructed programs in order to do anything more sophisticated at all. And this is all just sort of 35,000-foot view down on a system where humans are absolutely essential for so much everywhere inside this very, very large system. And so it's hard to even know where to start when we're talking about changing that basic feature. Saying, okay, well, here's what's going to change suddenly, and I think really quite abruptly. Certainly in the scheme of things, quite abruptly. Machines are going to be able to do, all kinds of complex tasks that hitherto could only be done by human beings, and then very, very soon afterwards, machines are going to be able to do virtually every complex task that a human can do, and in addition to that, be able to do it substantially better. And I would be very surprised if that entire transformation took longer than 20 years from today. And this is even without full-on artificial general intelligence, which is looking more and more likely as well on a sort of a 20 or so year time frame. So I mean, it's very difficult to know where to even begin preparing for a transformation of that magnitude. I am honestly still, after all these weeks of talking about it, I'm still at a loss for how to even, other than just tense up and brace for impact is basically about all I've got at this moment.
Invest wisely. Yeah, maybe on that topic, let's come at it a little bit obliquely. We were talking, I suppose the impetus for this discussion originally was talking about how could our institutions adapt, but antecedent to institutions is culture more broadly. So this change is clearly deep enough and broad enough that it's going to be as much the adaptation has to happen at many levels, policy and the actual technology of AI safety, and institutions need to adapt, and there needs to be regulation, but also it's a huge cultural shift that's going to take place. And it's interesting, I think, to reflect on what's happening with effective altruism. I haven't paid that much attention to it. It's been in the news recently because of Will MacAskill's new book. Maybe you've paid more attention to it than I have, Adam. I've been aware of it for years, and I sort of know what it's about, and I've read some of the articles written by Peter Singer and some of the other sort of protagonists in the movement. I have my criticisms of it, I suppose. I wouldn't call myself an effective altruist in the sense of aligning myself with the tribe, although I share a lot of emphasis on the long term and so on, things that I think draw people to the movement now. But it's clearly becoming a very influential movement, and certainly commands a lot of capital in the terms of donations and so on. And it's also having a very big impact on AI safety. So I don't know if that's something you're aware of, but I'll spell it out. I wasn't really clear on this until recently, when somebody who has a position that's funded by money that comes from effective altruism kind of explained it to me. But there's been a number of recent kind of AGI startups with a focus on safety. Anthropic is one of them, sort of spun out of OpenAI, kind of like a internal conflict there over how important safety is, I'm guessing. I don't know the details there. Anthropic has a lot of funding. I don't know what percentage of it comes from EA sources, and I don't have any inside knowledge of that. I'm just guessing some of it is. But there's a few organizations around, like a number of new ones to do with large language models that seem to be as though somebody with some relatively deep pockets has donated a bunch of money to people who are worried about AI safety, and this seems to likely to continue. So yeah, I'm not saying that all of them are funded by this money, but I think it's involved to a significant degree. And I think because the EA people, for example, Will MacAskill, talk seriously about AI safety. They're kind of like another voice besides Bostrom's and Stuart Russell and the kind of the people who've been worrying about this for a long time. And there are a set of voices that are quite influential among many young people. So it seems like AI safety is an issue, and not just like bias, but kind of like existential safety, is becoming more of a mainstream topic, largely due to the influence of this philosophical movement, which is quite an interesting dynamic. So, yeah, I'm bringing that up partly to. That's ringing. Yeah, I find it interesting how movements like that may play a very important role in adaptation to disruption at this scale, right? Given that it's as much, it's deep enough to trigger significant social changes. Yeah, I don't know what you think about all that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish I was more uh, intimately familiar with the goings on of the effective altruism movement. I had heard that McCaskill has a new book out. His name has come up on a few of the sort of podcasts that I'm aware of and occasionally listen to, although I honestly haven't been listening to very much recently. So he just kind of has come across my general sort of news radar, as it were. I've read a few of Peter Singer's books and have enjoyed his work for many years, 20 years or more now. And so I think there's it doesn't surprise me. I was not actually aware of a deep and long connection between the sort of the AI research community and the effective altruism movement. But it honestly doesn't surprise me. I mean, effective altruism is basically evidence-based philanthropy and evidence-based charitable giving, and so it doesn't surprise me because that sort of appeals to a irrational, rationalist kind of uh, uh, personality, or young people um, who are well intentioned but are not wedded to traditional institutions like religious traditions or whatever. Um, it doesn't surprise me at all that they would look to something like the effective altruism movement and see in it a way to participate in line with their own values, and if those values are primarily rooted in science and rationality and so forth. I think it seems, in other words, it doesn't surprise me, even though I wasn't aware of those connections before. Having you point that out, though, it's I mean, shared values it makes for strange bedfellows sometimes, right? And so it really is interesting that if somebody, for example, is very passionate about effective altruism, they could learn about and become quite animated and activated, I guess is a better word, become quite activated about other issues that their fellow effective altruist enthusiasts are interested in. Right? I mean, this is just how communities work. If you join a big community, you end up becoming aware of and oftentimes activated to start engaging with and caring about things that other members of that community are into. No surprise there, right? So if a whole bunch of people, I'm thinking of places like Less Wrong, that quite it really now, how far back does it go? 15 years, 20 years? That whole sort of community online, it's basically it's kind of a little bit of a social platform. But it's great. It's an old standing forum. I'm thinking, even thinking back to early Slashdot style days and early Reddit days and that kind of thing. It reminds me of stuff like that. But a lot of the conversation originally, I don't know what it's like now. I haven't been on there in years, but a lot of it was originally quite interesting. With about the risks of AI and so forth. And I remember reading some really fun stuff on there. So if this community is influential among effective altruists, then it brings that issue to the forefront of people's awareness who might otherwise not be paying that much attention to it. Fascinating cultural phenomenon, really. But I'd have to look into it more and think more carefully about it to see what if there's anything instructive we can learn there about how to prepare better at the individual or the community or the entire social level for this massive transformation that's coming. And I'm even hesitant now. I think this is bigger than a disruption, honestly. I mean, it's a disruption would be something like disrupting a specific kind of product, a specific market segment, or even an entire industry. But this is so much bigger than that. That I think this is a artificial intelligence is more than a disruption. It's a full on evolutionary paradigm shift. Yeah, it's completely in a different league. Honestly, I mean it may even be in a different league than fire and language and writing and the wheel, and certainly a bigger league than electricity. So I don't know if anything compares to it really, except I mean, like, you have to go back to things like the advent of I honestly think it's comparable to things like the eukaryotic transformation. The shift from single-celled organisms to multicellularity. It's something at that level, and that's not. Yes, the evolution of or maybe vertebrate evolution or something. The colonization of the land by marine organisms. 600. What was it? I guess the earliest plants were about 600 million years ago. No, more recent than that. 300 million years ago. It's something. It's something at that level of impact. I'm thinking more and more. I don't really know how to see it a different way. And so, how do you prepare for something like that? I mean, I'm not opposed to trying to continue to think about this through the lens of disruption. I don't think that that's necessarily, a waste of time, but I do want to be very much on guard against freighting in, onboarding assumptions from other disruptions and from the theory and things that have worked from smaller disruptions. I think we need to be very careful in assuming that this is going to look anything like, the disruption of film cameras by digital cameras, or the disruption of transportation by combustion engine vehicles. I mean, those were a big deal in their way, certainly, but this is so much. It's such a different, a different degree and scope of comprehensiveness and depth and breadth that, I'm sort of hesitant to make too many assumptions that what we think we know about technological change in other ways applies all that much here. I think we could find out that we're very, very wrong to extrapolate what we've seen with other technological disruptions to this situation. And I think, in fact, I think most of my team sort of, even we've had some discussions about this, but most of my team sort of feel this way. It's one reason why we haven't put out anything on this topic yet, is because we're sort of concerned that we make fools of ourselves if we try to pretend that this is the same as other disruptions, and that all of the usual thinking that we bring to bear applies in this situation, because it probably doesn't.
Yeah, let me then sort of describe some of the things I've paid attention to recently, and where I feel like more quantitative analysis might play a significant role in the discussion. So let's say there's roughly two camps. Put aside the people who maybe are just completely skeptical about human-level artificial intelligence arriving anytime soon. Let's assume it's coming. Timelines may vary, but let's say relatively soon. So let's accept, for the sake of what we're discussing, that it's going to be here in at most 20 years, something like that. Then among the people who think it's coming soon, there's roughly two camps. There's those who, a lot of the risks come down to whether it's fast or slow, relatively speaking, right? So fast would be, the kind of FOOM scenario, right? Where you turn on the machine and it gets just above human level, and then 10 seconds later it's mail ordering out for DNA that's going to make nanorobots and so on, right? And then 30 minutes after that, it's game over for the human race. So that's like the extreme version of fast.
Right. It's super hard takeoff. Boom is as they say, that's the. Yeah.
And then there's more of a slow takeoff. I've seen Sam Altman refer to his sort of prediction as short timeline, slow takeoff. And I think this is a good summary of a very broadly held position among tech circles, including, I think, the majority of people actually building these things, is my impression from kind of public statements and also private discussions. And so that short timeline, slow takeoff, the defense of that looks something like this. Well, clearly capabilities are accelerating very quickly, but as far as we know, getting to superhuman level will be maybe not purely, but at least to a large degree due to scale of data and compute. And there's a limit to how fast we can make GPUs, right? There's a finite number of GPUs in the world, and we make finitely many per year. And spinning up fabs that manufacture the cutting edge parts for the next generation of AI models, there's like 3 companies on Earth that can build those, and maybe really only one, TSMC. And it takes years to build a cutting edge fab. You can't just multiply them by 10 or 100 at will. And a large constraint there is engineers, not even materials, right? You need to train the engineers that can run these highly sensitive, complicated pieces of equipment. So they would point to that and the scaling laws and say, well, yeah, we're going to need a lot of compute, and it's going to take time to build that, even if we know we can do it. And so they would kind of say, we're already in the takeoff. It's just a matter of building out the stuff, and that's going to take time. And if there's time, if it's a slow takeoff, then, well, maybe we have some period of at least years between knowing we can do it and being able to do it, and we'll be able to reason effectively about safety issues in that period. Maybe that's also, you could already say that's pretty foolhardy to give yourself just a window of a few years to solve this incredibly difficult problem. But I think there's kind of, broadly speaking, these 2 camps. So there's people who think we may not have much time at all and we need to get it sorted out in advance, more or less. And then there's people that think, well, kind of the same approach we've taken with safety of many other engineering artifacts could apply with sufficient resources to this problem as well, and therefore there's no need to get really worried about this going sideways. To put a name on one of the people making this argument, so John Carmack had a long interview with Lex Fridman on his podcast a week or so ago, and that's basically his position. He's rich enough that he's bought one of these NVIDIA DGX stations. It's like $250,000 with a bunch of A100 GPUs in his basement. And he's trying to train AGI himself, right? And he's like, yeah, I reckon it'll take me 5 years on my own. So that's like the kind of so there you have, like, I think the existence of John Carmack is like is like a
well, isn't he the guy who created Quake?
Yeah, that's right.
Doom and that guy, and I think he was into rockets for a while. I mean, I think he's quite a polymath and genuinely pretty talented and bright guy. But I think it sounds like he may be making an assumption that I've seen others make, which is that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is probably something that we have the hardware to support already, and we just have to crack a few more key sort of ideas and principles and put them together. And it's almost like it's a puzzle to be solved as opposed to a mountain to be climbed, right? And I think those are sort of 2, even still after all these years, 2 sort of competing viewpoints on how AGI can be achieved. One is sort of we just have to continue hurling resources at this, compute resources and data resources and so forth. And the scaling laws, as they have emerged, have lent a lot of credence to that sort of perspective on this challenge. And then the other, I think, perhaps quite a bit older view that goes back several generations is this idea that AGI there's some minimal scale, some minimal amount of basically sheer processing power is necessary, but there are a few sort of secret sauces, design elements, something like that. Something key comes together, and if you look at biology, you can get a sense that if the right pieces come together, suddenly you get these extraordinary capacities that we associate with intelligence, human level intelligence, that you don't see in other mammals, for example, despite there not being 1,000 times more compute in a human brain than in a dog brain or something like that. And so it's I think this sounds a lot. Anybody who thinks they're going to go into their basement and toil away at this and crack the problem, it's somebody in that it sounds to me it's like somebody who's in that camp of, oh, we're just missing a few key ideas, and I'm really smart, and maybe I'll get lucky and figure them out and put them together.
Yeah, that's definitely his attitude. Yeah. I mean, yeah.
I mean, I don't have a basis to judge one way or the other. It may be one or the other, or perhaps it could be a combination of both. I mean, a couple of key architectural things happening, for example, in the human brain, together with, human brains are 3 times, prefrontal cortex anyways, 3 times the size in humans as it is in chimpanzees, much bigger than cats and dogs, for example. So scale certainly has something to do with it in humans.
Yeah, I think the question, I mean, it's not implausible for Carmack to crack something, because the original Transformer paper was trained on 1 or 2 GPUs, I forget. Certainly much less scale than he has access to now. And so it may be that, whatever key innovations are necessary, if any are necessary, can at least show promise on a system as big as the one he has, and then, immediately would be taken up by many other people with a lot more resources. So I don't think it's...
Well, I suppose this is another situation where, I mean, perhaps there's some middle ground between sort of the two camps, the FOOM scenario and the slower takeoff. And one way in which I can see some middle ground thing happening is that if a system starts to show promise, presumably, so say for example, a system really starts to appear to be generally intelligent, starts showing extremely strong and clear signs of sapience, of sentience, self-awareness, recursive self-modeling of self, and so forth. And it starts really having some of these features that we associate with being self-aware and blah, blah, blah. Okay. Presumably, if that were to happen, then that would not necessarily happen on the largest supercomputer on the planet. I mean, I suppose it's not impossible that it could happen on a big one, but if we were to see signs like that, there would be headroom. Well, I guess what I'm saying is there would be headroom to acquire additional compute, basically additional hardware resources, even in a hardware constrained world, right? Because we're not talking about using all of the available hardware in the world, and then if we achieve some human level AGI, that then we just have to wait for the slow process of building more more hardware. I think you're right that we are potentially hardware constrained, but the starting point for that is going to be, I think, well below the existing limit. Do you see what I mean? And so this would be something you wouldn't. I don't necessarily see the FOOM scenario as completely compelling. I can think of a number of reasons why. I mean, there's some implausibility there. It sounds a lot like science fiction sort of stuff to me, Hollywood sci-fi sort of stuff to me. But having said that, I can easily imagine AGI looking very promising. So, wow, suddenly we've got this thing, and then there being a path to very quickly, like in a matter of hours or days or certainly weeks, quite dramatically increasing the compute resources that are available to that particular system, even under a hardware constrained world like we live in, right? I mean, so say you're on a 1 exaflop machine, and suddenly you realize you've got AGI running on it. It wouldn't necessarily be impossible to quite quickly scale up that to 10 exaflops if you thought you were going to win the entire world by having that. which I think probably big corporations and governments think they will. And so, and who knows what I don't know, would that have a FOOM effect or not? That's, I suppose, harder to predict. So I agree, I think, in general, with the two ends of the spectrum. But I think see some room for some middle ground in which even if folks are right that it is, it's not automatically going to be a hard FOOM style takeoff. I think that the simple dynamics, the human dynamics involved, could mean that there could be an abrupt acceleration if we, suddenly realize, oh, we've got this in hand. Holy moly! All right, let's really throw everything we've got at this all of a sudden, kind of thing. So, and I actually worry a lot about that. Because I'm not as sanguine, I think, perhaps as you, about who's actually working on these things. I suspect that. I mean, I think there's. I strongly suspect there are more clandestine efforts going on than is widely recognized. I very strongly suspect the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. defense community, and those are not necessarily the same thing, that they both have. I strongly suspect that they're working on this stuff. And I think they could do something really, really stupid, if they happen to cross the line first. So yeah, that worries me quite a bit. I guess what I mean to say by all of this is I don't take a whole lot of comfort in the idea that a FOOM scenario is not preordained. I guess that's what my big takeaway from that.
Yeah, I agree. I suppose we might be guilty of, we're sitting here sounding very convinced about these predictions, but on the other hand, we're not really following through, or at least I'm not, with second order things that must therefore be the case. So I think it goes without saying that, 20 years is not enough time to sort out our existing inequality sufficiently to have any confidence that the outcome of this transition is in any way whatsoever democratic, right? So isn't this like an existential threat to not only democracy, but the kind of broad, classically liberal outlook on, at least in principle, people are equal? And in that case, well, what should be done in order to prepare? I mean, if we're not talking about adapting existing institutions, what can be done to preserve the ideals that are currently embodied in those institutions? It's not, we don't want to end up in whatever the head of OpenAI or DeepMind thinks is a good system of government, and right now they're probably pretty reasonable people, but
yeah, I mean, it's hard to. Again, I honestly, I'm not sure I know where to start, or I'm comfortable starting in any particular place. But I guess we can make some assumptions. So we can. I mean, if you have to think through these things in terms of scenarios, and I think I mentioned last time that the doomsday scenarios are perhaps not really not all that productive to talk about, because if they're unavoidable, or if there's not much that we can do, well then so talk about the scenarios that where we maybe have some agency in them, we being human beings, and people trying to think about this ahead of time. Make those assumptions. We talk about that. We can talk just about limit the discussion to just those scenarios. Okay, so you have an artificial general intelligence, and here again, our conversation has drifted, not drifted, but has zeroed in on general AI. Automation itself is hugely disruptive. So that just narrow AI has the potential to be massively disruptive. And a lot of labor, a lot of toil and drudgery, a hell of a lot of jobs in the global economy could be automated in much the same way that driving cars presumably can be automated, and then that work done by machines without the car necessarily being sentient, and without it achieving AGI. So I'm a little more comfortable thinking about narrow AI and its impacts and how maybe we prepare for those and so forth. But for AGI, which is a different, a very different kettle of fish altogether, the scenarios are, how quickly does something like this become significantly more intelligent than human beings? And then it's a question of what can a super intelligent agent do? I think if we have to at least make some assumptions about that before we can start talking about, okay, well, what preparations can we and should we make ahead of what that agent would do? We have to make decisions about what we're assuming the agent could do and might do, and construct scenarios around that before I think we can even begin speaking sensibly or thinking sensibly about how to prepare for for what it does.
But why is that necessary?
It might be worth it. Because if for example, we're assuming that we have an AGI that is not just approximately as intelligent as a human being, or an AGI that's as intelligent as the very, as someone like Einstein or whatever. I don't know who is widely regarded as the most intelligent person ever, but if we assume that, if we were assuming that this system is only going to be as intelligent as Einstein, well, nothing's going to change. Not much. I mean, especially if it needs an exascale system. I mean, if you want 1,000 people as smart as Einstein, you can go find those human beings right now and hire them. There are a lot of people out there, and maybe they're not quite that smart, but they're pretty close. That's a lot easier than spinning up 1,000 exascale supercomputers. So I'm not all that concerned about AGI that's only as smart as the smartest human beings. What I am concerned about, and what I do think would be impactful, is a machine that's vastly, vastly super intelligent, much, 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 much more intelligent than the very smartest human being, or even the very smartest collection of smart human beings. So, for example, much smarter than SpaceX, which is a collection of a lot of really bright people, or something like that. Much smarter than the physics department at Harvard, or whatever. Those sorts of things. That, I think, we have to.
I mean, that's one I think, property of these agents' intelligence. But I mean, right. When you say what they're like, I mean, so in one of the other seminars, we've sort of looked at some papers that are trying to characterize like properties that optimal agents have. They should be Bayesian, for example, and you might use that to predict something that they may or may not do, or how to control them or not. I find myself a little skeptical. I suppose I find those discussions interesting, but I'm not sure they necessarily are important to informing how we prepare for. I mean, you can make a lot of deductions just on the basis of assuming that, you'll have systems that can do all the work that the Harvard physics department does. That's enough to make many predictions about how society will change or how things need to be prepared for. I don't know that the details matter for that. They may matter for control problems, like how to keep the AI in a box.
Yeah. I mean, I keep coming back to my chief concern being, maybe I was overly influenced by Bostrom's book, a decade ago, the Superintelligence. But I keep coming back to thinking that is the much, much greater wild card, if not outright threat here. if we're talking about just systems that effectively are competition for human beings, as opposed to, if that's what we're talking about, systems that are merely competition for human beings, for the smartest human beings, then what we're talking about is not a whole lot different than the automation that I was, the narrow AI automation that I mentioned earlier. It's not a whole lot different than that. And that is a huge, that is a huge big deal. But it's more, I think, akin to the other disruptions that my team has looked at and that we've talked about, right? So, I mean, yes, if you have a machine that can drive as well as a human being, that competes with drivers, and that's a huge problem. It's going to be it's a huge problem, a huge opportunity. It's going to be a disruption, a big, really, really big deal. Blah blah blah. And then if you expand that to lots of occupations being outcompeted throughout the economy, okay, that is a big deal, huge big deal, potentially bigger than the other disruptions that we're thinking about are also on the cards: energy, transportation, food, etc. But those all seem, for lack of a better word, normal to me. Normal disruptions, like not sort of fundamentally revolutionary and paradigm shifting. Whereas a machine that can do things that no human being can even remotely do, and then because it's super intelligent, and all we can do is sort of stand back and look and say, geez, this is a godlike mind behaving in inscrutable ways. That is a much, I still see that as the much bigger threat, and ideally the much bigger opportunity, because that's the machine that's going to either wipe us out with very little effort, or escape our control with very little effort, or solve all of our problems with very little effort, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think those are two different categories of outcomes from this technology, and I wouldn't want to lump those together. The one I'm comfortable kind of thinking through as just basically in terms of as a regular disruption or normal disruption, more or less. But the super intelligence stuff, that's really, really hard. That's the whole singularity business, and I honestly don't know how to think through that. I'm at a loss. I mean,
I'm tempted to just not think about it. I mean, not that it's not important, but I could easily imagine a scenario in which we spend the next 10 years worrying about how to prevent extinction of the human race, from a super smart AI or something. And meanwhile, we lose many of the things we value about our society because, there's 5 people on Earth who are multi-trillionaires and the rest of us have been robbed of any agency whatsoever. And that's a problem that it seems like, it's kind of comparable to some of the problems we faced in the past, say from the Industrial Revolution, or going back further to like the invention of gunpowder or something. It is a problem we can think about and maybe do something about, or at least be prepared for. The other problem of existential risk is much thornier, and perhaps many smart people should think about it. But in practice, we're doing nothing about the former problem, right? Very few people worry about this or talk about it, and it could easily, be very destabilizing in a way that it seems possible to prepare for. I'm not, a nihilist. I am optimistic about the outcomes here, really. I want to be optimistic, and I think there are many optimistic scenarios, but I don't necessarily think, say, my personal time and energy that I want to devote to this topic is best spent kind of reasoning about the, how to stop AIs from doing the things we don't want them to do. I think we're plenty capable of doing things to ourselves, just with very smart, narrow systems that would be very problematic. So, increasingly see a big gap between these two sets of, you might call them safety concerns. And I think both are important, but I kind of do want to separate them a bit, because if they're combined, the existential risk questions are kind of intellectually interesting and philosophically interesting and technically interesting in a way that can maybe just stop people from paying sufficient attention to the more mundane but also important questions of, how to safeguard our institutions and some of our values against, the most extreme forms of power and wealth inequality that have existed in human history. Maybe that already describes our current condition, but we're about to test, even more orders of magnitude there with pretty high probability. So I kind of want to know if there's anything we can do about that, or ways to think about that.
If that's where we want to focus the conversation and our thinking, I agree. It seems like that's, at least there we have some ground to stand on. I personally am much more optimistic about that. The potential impacts. I mean, so I am less worried about a dystopian sort of outcome where there's an enormous amount of wealth in just a few hands. I think in functional terms, in social terms, that just kind of sucks. I mean, it sucks that there are billionaires in the world. It does. It sucks. It's unfair. It's unjust. It's an ugly situation. That's really aesthetically and socially, but functionally, I don't think it really makes that much of a difference. I mean, the billions of dollars that are, in principle, commandable. They're under the discretionary control of individuals. If somebody who's a billionaire ostensibly has discretionary control over that amount of resources. I don't really think that translates in directly so often into sort of calamitous outcomes in the real world. Surprisingly rare. I mean, there are places where you have mad dictators, like Muammar Gaddafi was worth, over $100 billion probably. And Libya was an impoverished country, and it was a very ugly and very, pretty dystopian sort of situation there, and so these things do happen. Putin is perhaps another example, and these things are very ugly. But there are thousands of billionaires in the world, and most of them are not Muammar Gaddafi or Vladimir Putin. And people, Bill Gates and Elon Musk are big targets, and yada yada. But it doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't make that much difference who owns all of those Tesla shares. Whether, it's owned by 1,000 people or one person, they're just Tesla shares, and Tesla does what it does. And, I think we're, in a lot of ways, we're fortunate that what it's doing is quite positive in many ways. And it's not positive in every way, but in many ways. And so I'm a little less concerned about, the scenarios where individuals become ultra wealthy. I mean, we've had scenarios certainly like that in the past that were pretty ugly. I mean, kings of the past who commanded enormous resources relative to the most impoverished of their subjects. That was a really ugly. Those were throughout history, and in a handful of situations that are left, they are still ugly today. But I don't really see how we backslide all that far into sort of the hideousness of feudal or medieval kind of living under tyrants, unless violence becomes part of the picture, unless Elon Musk is able to flip a switch somehow and give himself an army of 10 million Tesla bots that are just very difficult to stop, purely in terms of violence, purely in terms of physicality. And so short of a scenario like that, and I don't mean to dismiss that, but I don't think those are very high probability outcomes where individuals obtain a huge amount of control over the use of force. I think that the use of force is going to remain largely monopolized by states. And because of that, I honestly am not that worried. I've come to view sort of capitalism and the wealth generated by nations, perhaps I don't know. I don't know what the right word is. Maybe I'm just getting more conservative in my old age. But I guess what I'm finding less compelling as I get older is the argument that capitalism is functionally, its actual real outputs suck. I'm finding those arguments weak, and I'm finding the weight of the arguments for alternative modes of organizing society and production. I'm finding those to be largely aesthetic and driven by aesthetic senses of justice and fairness and so forth. And those are all fine. It's not to say that none of those resonate with me, but I'm not terribly concerned about them. Okay. So then the question in my mind is, can societies as a whole, even admitting that we may have a few very ugly, ultra wealthy people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and for their all their flaws, we may have a few ultra wealthy people like this who have too much control over certain markets and so forth. Okay, fine. But admitting that, what kind of world is going to emerge, and how do we prepare for it? What kind of world is going to emerge when capital in the form of machines is able to do the majority of the work of the tasks that human beings do today? What kind of world are we going to live in? What kind of world could we create? What kind of world do we want to? What kind of worlds do we want to avoid? And there, I'm honestly really quite optimistic. Really quite optimistic, because I don't see a whole lot of plausible pathways to truly dystopian scenarios. Like, okay, so let me just give you an example, right? So you often think of the like Judge Dredd style scenarios or Terminator scenarios or whatever. And I just don't find those all that plausible. If you were to have 100 million humanoid, Tesla bots. Okay, so they say they succeed, and you've got this these Boston Dynamics style bipedal robots, and there's 100 million of them walking around. What are they going to do? What use are they going to be put to? Are they really going to just walk around all day in police uniforms, policing citizens? Was this what we're going to do with them? Is that plausible? Or is it much more plausible that whoever controls them is, unless they're truly a madman like Muammar Gaddafi, that whoever controls them is just going to have them do work. They're just going to have them do the work that most of us fucking hate doing right now. Mopping floors and flipping burgers and washing toilets and taking out the garbage and picking through the recycling at the recycling plant, and fixing shit when it breaks and building stuff that people want. I mean, if you had 100 million robots, would you, and I'm talking in the most likely scenario, states, would you dedicate that capacity to, overwhelmingly to destructive ends, to dystopian, policing and brutalizing and oppressing your citizens? Or would you mostly just set them to productive tasks? Probably, in my mind, mostly you just set them to productive tasks. Now, maybe it is ugly that some hundreds of thousands of them we might have robotic police officers. And I don't find that all that dystopian personally.
Yeah, I guess
I can talk about some reasons why, but I think I'm fundamentally optimistic because I don't see the truly dystopian scenarios as all that plausible. I think it's very likely that once we start building tons and tons and tons of these robots, we're just going to use them.
I guess these are the things. I guess I agree with that. I guess that's not where my principal concern lies. I guess we should wrap up, and maybe this can be a topic we pick up next time. But I think what I'm mostly worried about is, if I think about, okay, the university has a union, right? And we argue with management about what should and should not be happening at the university. People should get paid for the work they do, and maybe we should get paid a little bit more, okay, there's these kinds of arguments in society, and a lot of them come down to basically the threat to walk, right? Like, here's my labor, it's worth something, and then we negotiate over it, and what I can do is withdraw my labor. And that's, it's very deeply baked into our societies in ways that we obfuscate because it's not nice, right? We don't find it, it does undermine cooperation and the spirit of fraternity within the university to have these discussions between the administrators and the faculty, right? And if there's too many of them, it kind of weakens the morale of the institution. So we have these conversations in a way that are often very obfuscated. And, discussions between managers and employees are, generally one-on-one, and it's kind of a little hush-hush. And, there are reasons for that, right? It's not something we do completely out in the open, and for good reason, I think. But for that reason, I think we underestimate the degree to which a lot of our institutions and interactions are just predicated on not only economic value, which is, I guess, something that's kind of obvious, but just on, it could easily be the case that there are AIs soon that are just better at listening to you than your spouse, or which you've had in your pocket since you were a kid and know everything about you, and they know a lot of things you're worried about. And what do we do when some of our closest interpersonal relationships are with these systems? I'm not saying that's a good idea, but many people have relationships like that already with virtual girlfriends and stuff. And it's funny in a way, but it's also rather troubling to think about. There are millions of lonely people in China that are like kind of happy to have, I forget the name of it, I read an article recently. It's like some chatbot. It's pretty pathetic in terms of its capabilities, this chatbot, but it's a sign of not only economic utility, but also interpersonal utility being kind of disrupted by these systems, which, it's hard to imagine right now what it'll be like to have an AI that has been with you your entire life since you were a child, knows a lot about you, and just, it's like you're the only concern it has, and it just really cares about you. Or at least you perceive that it cares about you. That's not very far-fetched at all, given what we can do currently. And I think this will undermine a lot of the ground that we currently place our relationships on, not only work ones, but personal ones. So I think that's more like what I'm worried about, rather than, like police bots.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point. That this, and again, I guess suppose I was thinking that that really it's AGI that throws open the door to the sort of. Have you seen the movie Her? Yeah, so I'm thinking that for machines to give human beings, truly satisfying, rich and full relationships, that artificial general intelligence may be a precondition, a necessary, precondition for that, a prerequisite for that. I think you're right, Dan. That I've been making that assumption. It's probably false, given what we already see. That people have relationships with much simpler systems and become very attached to them. And I suppose it should be no surprise. Children, become very attached to inanimate, stuffed animals, and we care for virtual pets and video game environments, and there. So I suppose it is plausible to assume that even without artificial general intelligence, there could be social and psychological disruptions from other sort of quasi-intelligent agents that we're spending a lot of time interacting with. And it's certainly possible that some of this is already happening. We're just not aware of it, right? I mean, the influence that bots have on social media, for example, is
just social media itself, which is clearly disrupted.
Or social media itself. You're right. Yeah.
I mean, it's our natural environment doesn't include like entities that will just pay infinite attention to us, but when you put into someone's psychological environment a potentially infinite source of attention, it clearly disrupts their relationships with other people, and many people just can't handle that. There's like an evolutionary process where, some people are just like sort of socially disabled by focusing too much on the feedback signals they get from social media as just a kind of proxy for. I mean, obviously people relate to it as though it's like somebody in their immediate environment who's just like super interested in them or something. So we can see it already happening. It's just like, rather than being an AI, it's kind of a weighted sum of all the other human beings on the social network or something. So yeah, I think there's under-anticipated like consequences of deploying these systems in many places that touch ordinary life. That will have profound effects, and maybe disaggregating effects on us. Maybe if you have a final comment, let's maybe wrap this up with that.
Yeah, I'm interested to carry on the conversation on these lines next time. This idea of what unhealthy outcomes socially and psychologically might we want to guard against, both as individuals and then as entire societies, in anticipation of technologies emerging that effectively prey upon our some of our vulnerabilities and psychologically and socially. And I think that's probably a very good thing to think about, and it is, I think, probably a more subtle but also a more plausible form of threat than the Terminator or the Judge Dredd, robots walking around, RoboCop kind of, robots walking around policing us sort of scenario. It's probably, it may, or it could be both, I have some ideas for how to push back against it too. I think circumstances. So our social circumstances interact very strongly with, and I think are quite well. Let's just say they're strongly coupled with our material circumstances, and so I think people who are socially vulnerable, I strongly suspect there is a high correlation between social vulnerability and then material vulnerability. And so the people who are impoverished, people who are on the edge, they're just barely hanging on, people who feel they're precarious in their lives and their material security, I suspect that they are much more vulnerable than people who are very secure materially. So one way perhaps that societies could prepare for these particular threats would be to do a combination of ensuring that we are less vulnerable and more secure psychologically in our individual lives, socially in our relations with our communities and others, and then also materially, because if you're not worried where your next meals come from or how you're going to pay the bills next week, then maybe it's easier to put your phone down and take a walk outside. In exactly the same way that if you're not hanging on by your fingernails, it's easier to put the bag of potato chips down, right?
Yeah.
And and I think there's very strong evidence that we see that already. Yeah. So maybe we can continue talking about that next week. That'd be great.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. See you then.
All right. Take care, guys. Bye.